In this third and final lecture of both Lesson 14 and of our course in Introduction to Dogmatics, we will continue our comparative and synthetic consideration of East and West by considering Palamas and Scotus, articulating in common a metaphysics of infinity and positing, because of their common understanding of infinity, which arguably does derive from their forebears, namely for Palamas, especially the Cappadocians, St. Dionysius the Areopagite and St. Maximus the Confessor, and for Scotus, the Augustinian, Bonaventuran theological heritage, positing a nature of distinction that doesn't imply real separability or independence with respect to God's essence and energies, or essence and properties, and then opening up a way for understanding synergy as theosis, that is, a common participation in the divine energies between God and creature, deified creature, that doesn't entail the creature becoming infinite in God or comprehending the infinity of God, nor does it entail God becoming a composite reality with creature or entering substantially into that creation. Rather, it is through God's energies or participle attributes that creatures enter into a synergistic interrelationship and activity with God in theosis. And again, this collection of texts is by no means exhaustive, and one would need to engage in further study, refining some of the topics in order to really specify more clearly and adequately the deep continuity I'm arguing for between Palamas and Scotus on the one hand, and remaining points of ambiguity, incompleteness, or even disagreement between the two figures. But again, this essay is simply for the sake of motivating a consideration of the likelihood and arguing for the likelihood of a fundamental compatibility between Byzantine Eastern theology and Latin Western theology by looking at St. Gregory Palamas and Blessed John Duns Scotus. To begin, then, we can look at St. Gregory Palamas' notion of infinity. And even though this passage doesn't in itself specify infinity, it implies infinity, even if the word is lacking. And so we read in St. Gregory Palamas, quote, "But even if we affirm that this energy is inseparable from the unique divine essence, that is, any uncreated energy, the superessential is not for that reason composite. Superessential here implies infinity. Infinity is that which is beyond contraction through, or a limiting entity or form through some sort of concrete finite essence. Rather, superessential is beyond any individual essence and thus is intensively infinite." So going on then, we read in St. Gregory, "Without doubt, no simple essence would exist if it were so. For one would search in vain for a natural essence without without an energy. Thus, with the divinity, the infinite, superessential Godhead also is manifested and acts through his energy, or in our case, his divine energies. And it would be impossible to determine any kind of essence, natural essence, without an energy." And this should harken back to our discussion of St. John Damascene on Christology, insofar as St. John Damascene taught us that every essence has an energy or energies. Blessed John Duns Scotus, for the Latin West, may, in terms of the great Latin doctors, have the most robust and articulated notion of infinity. We read in Scotus, quote, "But formal intensive infinity, that is, infinity that qualifies or characterizes the essence itself, and not in terms of extension or multiplication, and fundamental infinity are together." Fundamental infinity referring not to the diversification that can be implied through intensive infinity through various perfections and attributes, but rather as a controlling and grounding infinity that simply maps onto what Palamas might call super essential. These two forms of infinity, Scotus explains, are together, there in the divine essence qua essence, and for this reason it is called by the Damascene a sea. Still, formal infinity, not only fundamental infinity, is in every other perfection, not only in the will unqualifiedly, for each one has its own formal perfection from the infinity of essence, just as from a root and foundation. Without going too deeply into the fine distinction Scotus is making here between formal and fundamental infinity, the point is that in each attribute, because it is identical with the divine essence, will be itself formally infinite in its mode of being. Thus, any instance of a formal perfection that is not rooted fundamentally in the divine essence will be finite. And so you can have formal perfections that are identical, yet in mode infinitely distinct. In God, wisdom, for example, or will, since Scotus used that example, is formally infinite because that perfection is rooted in the fundamental infinity of God, while will in a creature, though still will, is formally finite because the essence of a creature is formally and fundamentally finite, even though will or wisdom can be participated by both. Thus, we have an instance where a perfection of God is spoken of with respect to the creature, but with the proper modal distinction between finite and infinite. So the point here is that Scotus is articulating a notion of infinity. And this notion of infinity doesn't collapse into a kind of monism with respect to the creature being subsumed up into the divinity itself, nor does it collapse into a kind of pantheism with God being collapsed or confounded with creation. No, there's a distinction. And this next passage helps articulate that distinction. Scotus writes, "The infinity of the divine essence is more perfect than any other infinity." And this makes one wonder what he would have thought of Cantor's understanding of various discontinuous infinities that ultimately are reducible to absolute infinity. The examples he gives, Scotus gives, are infinites of thinking perceptibles or of notions. Going on, Scotus writes, "Yet God comprehends the infinity of his own essence from the nature of the object. This is because God's thinking, his comprehension, is ontologically identical with his being." Going on again with Scotus, "Therefore God is able to comprehend any other infinity, and consequently, if there is even an idea that is perhaps a thought object, then there are infinite ideas in the divine mind." This sounds a lot like Maximus and Bonaventure, and it harkens again to the divine energies, distinct divine energies, yet really identical with the divine being. Going on, Scotus writes, "If, too, an idea perhaps exists as a thought object, since the former are infinite and are in respect of himself as infinite, and in such wise the same follows as before, since the ideas are infinite, however granted, namely, that the infinity of the essence is more perfect than whatsoever other infinity, as of thought object or whatsoever other items, then it is obvious that God's infinity, which is the character of the divine essence, that fundamental infinity, is utterly first and unparticipated." Thus, with Scotus, like Palamas, God's absolute infinity is superessential, it is uncomprehended and imparticiple. Scotus, going on, then says, yet another infinity is by way of participation. Formalities being participated by creation, which are reductively founded in God himself. For the infinity of the essence is a quasi-cause of the infinity of objects existent in thought, whence the infinity of other items is by means of a return or a retracing back to the infinity of the essence. The point here is, again, is that the absolute divine infinity, which is superessential and incomprehensible, is the ground of all other possible notions of infinity, and the possibility of distinguishing within that infinity formal perfections that are participle by creatures under their proper formality, yet in a finite mode. This sounds a lot like the distinction again between essence and energies, between the nature and its energies. God's infinite nature manifests itself through energies or formalities or powers that are participated by creatures. And insofar as a creature participates that common formality, that creature acts synergistically with God in that common activity, even though the creature never becomes infinite and God never becomes finite. So if for Palamas and Scotus, the divine essence is absolutely infinite, and that divine essence contains an infinite number of ideas and thus also energies or operations which are participle because they are not in themselves implicative of the fundamental infinity or absolute infinity of the divine essence, then we have to be able to make a distinction that doesn't collapse or actually compound the divine being into multiple parts, but yet doesn't collapse the distinction into a kind of amorphous and unintelligible, indistinguishable soup. So Palamas, when he writes of this distinction, and again, this is only one example, he writes, using the example of wisdom, that wisdom comes to man through effort and study. The Lord appears in one way to the ethical man, yet in another way to the contemplative, and to the theological man in one way, and yet another way to the zealous, or to those become divine, that is, who are fully deified. There are numerous differences in the divine vision itself, obviously following because there are distinct energies that God operates through. But to Moses, he appeared, quote, face to face and not through enigmas. Recall the testimony of Maximus, deification is enhypostatic. So the deification occurs in the creator, even though the energy is not a hypostasis. The deification takes place in and through a hypostasis, that is, a created person. So in the created person, the energy operates in order for that created person or hypostasis to become like God without becoming God, or literally to become God without becoming the God. Going on in another passage, Palamas writes, the Akindanists do not accept, nor are they capable of knowing the indivisible distinction in God. That's important to note. It's indivisible, yet it's distinct. So there is a non-complexifying distinction in God. Even when they appear to us saying of the undivided union in accord with the saints, that one aspect of God is incomprehensible and the other comprehensible. For they do not know that God is indivisibly divided or united divisibly and experiences neither multiplicity nor composition. So thus there has to be a distinction that allows for a recognition of non-identity, but yet doesn't result in a true multiplication of entities. So on the one hand, then you have a real distinction in Latin terminology, which implies separability and or independence. So for example, there's a real distinction then between myself and my pet dog. I am independent in my existence from my pet dog, and my dog is independent in his existence from me. Moreover, we're two different entities. We are really distinct. And it's unlike if you take another extreme in Latin theological and philosophical terminology, of a distinctio rationis, or a distinction of reason, which is a distinction reason makes in order to better understand one thing. It doesn't imply independence and or real separability. An example of this sort would be when analyzing a ball, to analyze the ball under the aspect of its spherical nature and the aspect of its circular nature. Now, with the ball, we can recognize that a true sphere has a circular reality in 2 dimensions, and the same ball, has a spherical reality in 3 dimensions, although you could neither separate nor could you really distinguish sphericity from circularity in a particular ball. Rather, the mind distinguishes between these 2 aspects in order to better understand the ball itself through these 2 distinct concepts. So what we have to find then is a distinction that allows for difference without separation and or independence. And this is what Scotus calls the formal distinction. And this derives from the same problem that St. Gregory of Palamas was wrestling with. The fact that God is infinite, that God has an infinite number of energies and ideas, and so on. Of course, we can't come up with an exhaustive list of God's powers, energies, and perfections because he's infinite, fundamentally infinite, and thus he's intensively infinite. But yet, on the other hand, then, we have to have distinction, but yet we can't say that somehow God's wisdom is separable or independent, to take an example, from God's justice or his will, or even the person of the Father or the Son or the Spirit. Rather, these are what are called formalities, or differences that impose themselves on the mind because one formality or reality is irreducible to the other. Yet these formalities, as they exist in the infinite being of God, cannot be separated or broken up into parts, nor is God merely the composition of these various perfections. So a formal distinction is the distinction that recognizes difference, that is imposed upon the mind by the nature of the case itself, rather than the mind imposing itself upon the thing in order for its own better understanding. Moreover, the formal distinction posits that these entities are neither separable nor independent. So, this is an in-between distinction between a real distinction and a distinction of reason. It's a real distinction insofar as the nature of the case imposes itself on the mind, but it's like a distinction of reason insofar as the formalities or realities under discussion aren't separable or independent. John Duns Scotus also notes this kind of distinction, and I'm reading again the quote I read in an earlier passage because it's so apropos. He writes, "The infinity of the divine essence is more perfect than any other infinity. Yet God comprehends the infinity of his own essence from the nature of the object. That's because God's infinity is God himself, and his understanding is infinite because his understanding is God himself. Therefore, God is able to comprehend any other infinity," meaning any infinity that can be spoken of with reference to distinction and multiplication. Consequently, even if there is even an idea that is perhaps a thought object, since God comprehends infinite objects, then there are infinite ideas in the mind of God. So if there are infinite ideas that are distinct, they have to be distinct in some way. These ideas must be distinct, though, in a way that doesn't imply separability and or independence from one another or from the divine being itself, nor can they be something that can be just imposed by the divine will in trying to better understand himself. So these infinite ideas are objective, yet they're not separable or independent. Going on then, Scotus writes, if an idea perhaps exists as a thought object, since the former thought objects, that is, are infinite, and are in respect of himself as infinite, and in such wise the same follows as before, since the ideas are infinite. So the point is that if you have an infinite being, he will have an infinite number of ideas, because an infinite number of ideas just simply follows from the infinite perfection of divine knowledge. However, granted, namely, that the infinity of the essence is more perfect whatsoever than any other infinity, then it is obvious that God's infinity, which is the character of the divine essence, is utterly first and unparticipated. Again, a distinction then between God's infinite divine essence and his divine ideas, his divine properties, his divine energies. The logic follows with respect to any particular object or area or aspect of consideration when speaking of the divine being. Yet another infinity is by way of participation, for the infinity of the essence is a quasi-cause of infinity of objects existent in thought. So in this sense, God's ideas are as a result of his super-essential absolute infinity. So there's a quasi-derivative infinity with respect to the ideas, and thus a quasi-derivative infinity with respect to the energies. And these ideas and energies can be participated insofar as they are instantiated in creation, and insofar as they are participated through creation, through the deification of the Holy Spirit and the taking upon of the created person, on the part of the created person, these divine perfections, such as supernatural charity, supernatural wisdom, and the like. So whence the infinity of any other items is by means of a return to the infinity of essence. So thus all these other infinities that we may be able to speak of are able to be reduced to or traced back to the absolute and fundamental infinity of the divine being. So again, with Scotus, we have on the one hand a positive metaphysics of infinity, just like we have with St. Gregory following Maximus and the Cappadocians, wherein God is literally infinite, but yet in his infinity, he is not, we find no real difference. And by real difference, I mean separability or independence of any of these items under consideration. Neither energy from essence, nor energy from energy. And so, hearkening back to the semiotic and logos epistemology of Saints Maximus and Saint Bonaventure, we find then that God, in a true and real and ontologically robust manner, speaks into creation through his energies, exemplifying his ideas, and creation truly is indicative of God's ideas and God's energies insofar as they participate in these eternal and divine realities, yet fail either singly or collectively to exhaust or comprehend that fundamental and absolute infinity of the divine being itself. So thus we find with with Palamas and Scotus, two common threads of a positive notion of infinity and a need implicit in Palamas and very explicit in Scotus of formulating a distinction or a language a philosophical instrument through which we can articulate a robust notion of God that isn't reductive or pagan, yet doesn't fall prey to a kind of monism or pantheism. And so we find here another instance where Latin and Greek metaphysics do have a common source and a common consideration of the apostolic faith as revealed in Christ about God and his perfection, and also which in turn undergird and help to more fully articulate that revelation itself through philosophical and metaphysical and linguistic refinements.